All right, today I'm going to be talking about VO2max. So VO2max is actually a really interesting biomarker. It is one of the strongest predictors of longevity, and it's been popularized by people like Peter Attia. It's actually been shown in numerous studies to be one of the strongest protectors against chronic disease, and it's a really interesting physiological basis for this metric. So I'm actually going to go into the molecular basis of VO2max and why it is such an important integrated measure of our whole body fitness and exercise capacity. So VO2max, I'm going to break down what it actually stands for. So V is for volume of oxygen or O2, and max stands for maximal. So in case you've actually never understood what VO2max stood for, it's for the maximal volume of oxygen that your body can take in and utilize during intense exercise. We measure VO2max. I used to do these all the time when I was working at the National Institutes of Health. I've done them on myself, my wife, and a bunch of different people. It's a really cool test, but you do it through indirect calorimetry. So indirect means, so a calorie, for example, is a unit of heat, and you can actually measure calorie burning directly with a direct calorimeter. It's actually if the whole room is made of water, and you can actually see how much heat is required to change the degrees of water in a direct calorimeter, and that will tell you how many calories you're burned. So if someone is putting out enough heat as a consequence of energy that they burned, they can actually change a circulating pool of water a certain amount of degrees difference, and so that's how you would directly measure calories. It's not so practical. It's actually very hard to get a sealed water chamber. I've never actually seen one, but at the NIH, we had whole rooms where we could measure oxygen and CO2. And from that, you can look at oxygen consumption. And we can also put on a mask like you see here that actually just directly measures oxygen concentration at the level of the air and at the level of your pre and post breath. So you can see the difference in oxygen that's utilized by the whole body level. And so that integrated measure of how much the rate at which you're using oxygen is actually how we're measuring VO2 max. So you might see things like the Apple Watch or things estimating VO2 max. That's probably just an estimate based on heart rate. I don't know if we know the algorithms publicly, but I'll show you what that basis probably is from. So the way a VO2 max test actually works is you can put someone on a bike or a rowing machine or a treadmill or whatever you want, and then you'll slowly increase the intensity such that it requires more and more effort in order to be able to match the intensity that you set on that bike or on the treadmill or whatever. And as your body requires more energy and demands more energy, you're going to use more oxygen to actually meet those demands. And at the same time, you'll see an increase in heart rate. That's because your heart has to increase the amount of blood that's pumped throughout the body to deliver oxygen to skeletal muscles. And you can see a characteristic curve. And the VO2 max, or the volume of the rate at which oxygen is consumed, usually we do it relative to body weight. But you can see that the amount of oxygen consumed eventually reaches a plateau, even though the intensity of the exercise is continuing. And that peak, that top point, that maximal volume of oxygen that can be used per minute, that rate of oxygen consumption is considered the VO2 max. Now, what the VO2 max actually is measuring is the subject of this topic. I think VO2 max tests are really fun, but they're really hard to do. I think that's why different wearables would like to have proxies of this really important measure, but I'm going to break down what it is. And now we're going to follow the journey of oxygen from the atmosphere all the way to the mitochondria, because that's really what VO2 max is an integrated measure of. So the amount of oxygen in the air is about 21% or 20.93%. Oxygen is taken up in our lungs, and that oxygen then gets exchanged at that small thin layer of cells, endothelial cells, across which the lung interface meets the red blood cell interface at capillaries. And so oxygen can just diffuse from the lungs to the blood vessels, and then oxygen gets packaged onto hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the protein in the blood that gives it that red color that can then be passed throughout the body through our arteries and arterioles. Ultimately, oxygenated blood gets itself to skeletal muscle, and as exercise is happening and the muscles are contracting, that oxygen will get delivered at the level of the capillary to that muscle cell interface. So oxygen then is diffused or is offloaded from red blood cells into muscle cells. And I have these blue dots here. These are my symbolic mitochondria, and that will be the subject of the next part of this talk. And one thing that I want to say is that, there's a lot of conversation often about, will that increase the amount of calories I burn? What can increase energy expenditure? And I want to make the point here from the molecular level is that you will not burn more calories unless there's a demand to burn more calories. How that actually manifests at the molecular level is at the level of how much ATP you have. So ATP is the universal energy currency. When you adenosine triphosphate, so there's 3 phosphate molecules. When you cleave off that third phosphate molecule to make ADP, the breakage of that bond can fuel work. It can actually provide the energy to do different molecular functions, like actually cause the proteins to interact that mediate skeletal muscle contraction. So if you need more ATP, that will be reflected in the ratio of ADP to ATP. If the ratio is low, meaning that there's way more ATP in the mitochondria relative to ADP, there will be no reason to use energy and burn more calories and use oxygen. If you already have ATP, that just means that your muscles or whichever organ aren't using the ATP. You don't need to make a lot more. But during an exercise test or a VO2max test, you will see very high ratios of ADP to ATP, meaning we need to get more ATP so that we can perform more skeletal muscle contractions. And so that's just a point I want to reiterate, is that calories will not be used or energy will not be expended unless there's a high ADP to ATP ratio or some other driving force that will require energy. And now I'm going to start layering in details to the muscle mitochondria. We're going to talk about things like the electron transport chain and ATP synthase. These are the really nitty-gritty molecular details that are required for energy expenditure. And so, given this hypothetical muscle mitochondria that we have, there is a high ADP to ATP ratio, and that means oxygen is going to go to the matrix, so the inside of the mitochondria. Mitochondria actually have 2 membranes. It's an organelle inside of all of our cells. And skeletal muscles, the pictures look crazy. It's like basically a whole network that like surrounds a skeletal muscle cell. It's actually, that's, along a skeletal muscle cell. It's actually very interesting. But oxygen goes across the outer membrane and the inner membrane into the matrix, where it can be used in its relationship with the electron transport chain. And so now I'm going to layer on these protons as H plus and electrons as E minus. And what the electron transport chain, this is just to let you know that there's a charge difference between the matrix and the intermembrane space. And that charge difference is actually crucial for the synthesis of ATP. As electrons are transported across these 4 complexes of the electron transport chain, they're actually transported by carriers like NADH and FADH2. I won't get into that. But suffice to say that electrons move along its charge gradient, it's transported across the electron transport chain. And while that's happening, protons can be pumped against this charge gradient from the inside of the matrix to the outside of the intermembrane space. Now, the reason that charge gradient, meaning the difference of the protons in the matrix and the intermembrane space, the reason that charge gradient is important is because that sets up a driving force. And ultimately, where oxygen comes in is in order to make sure that this process can happen smoothly. All these electrons come bumping along. Eventually, that charge has to be dissipated somewhere. The electrons combine with hydrogens and oxygen to make water. And so oxygen then serves as the final electron acceptor along this electron transport chain. And the net result then is a big charge difference between the matrix and the intermembrane space. That charge difference is then used in order to synthesize ATP. So you can't make ATP, you basically have this issue in the cell where how do you make energy out of nothing? And it's sort of like, for example, when you see a river moving and the river is flowing along river, and then you have one of those water wheels that as the river flows against it, that water wheel can churn and actually could run a sewing machine or some other piece of, you can actually use the work because the water is flowing along that channel, and you have this water wheel that's transforming that kinetic energy of the water flowing into another form of energy they can use for work. So what the mitochondria end up doing is there's already this flow of electrons and then this big charge difference. We're able to use that charge difference to spin ATP synthase and convert ADP to ATP, which is what we wanted in the first place. Now ATP is able to be transported through transporters from the inside of the mitochondrial matrix to be used outside of the mitochondria for any work that you need to do. Now let me recap the journey of oxygen from the air to our contracting skeletal muscle. Oxygen from the air enters our lungs, passes across the cells that line the smallest ends of our lungs, and is transferred to red blood cells where it binds hemoglobin. Oxygenated blood then enters the heart, where it is then pumped through the left ventricle, into the aorta, through the arteries, through the arterioles, and end up at the capillaries, which are the smallest components of blood vessels that are then interface with our skeletal muscle. These capillaries are where the gas exchange actually occurs and oxygen can diffuse across it. If there's a sufficient energy demand, meaning we have way less ATP relative to ADP, meaning we want to create more ATP, then oxygen will move to the inside of the mitochondria and then will serve as the final electron acceptor of the electron transport chain. The flow of electrons is important in order to maintain a charge gradient. That charge gradient is then used to power ATP synthase that creates ATP from ADP. Then that ATP can be used to meet the energy demands. So, how much oxygen then that you can get inside your muscle mitochondria becomes a limiting factor for aerobic exercise capacity. And that is the basis of the VO2max. If you'd like to hear the story of the Nobel Prize winning scientists who helped us understand the molecular basis of oxygen transport, check out Noble Innovation Podcast. And in the first episode, we talk about August Crowe, who is the scientist that actually discovered how oxygen is transported across capillaries. We'll detail his life and some of the lessons we can glean from a scientist working through key problems. And if you like this video, please press like and subscribe. And let me know if it was too much detail, if you'd like me to spend more time talking about something, or if there's any other topics related to metabolism that you're interested, let me know in the comments. Thank you.